So we are in chapter 42. We're about a little more than halfway through this chapter, and we're addressing the following issue. And we mentioned that every single Jew has within them that Moshe Rabbeinu infused, the Rebbe inspired your true identity of a God-fearing self. And the question is, like we said, to tap into it. We all have inside of us that truth, that true identity of who we are as Jews and our true self. That's really what makes us ourself. The question is, how do we tap into it? I'm just someone's making a little bit of noise. I'm just gonna mute some people here. Give me 1 second. Okay. So basically the question we said was, number one, how do we tap into it? And more practically, we want to address the, sorry, 1 second. And more practically, we wanted to address a particular question. And that question was as follows. If we could see God and see God in front of us, all of us would have a very clear and a sense of God's presence. The reality is, a foundation of Judaism is God has no eyes, God has no body, God has no form. You know, human nature is very interesting. As much as we don't consider other people so significant as we should, we are intimidated in our behavior very much by other people. Someone who would do things that are inappropriate. If a 10-year-old child, if a stranger, if someone, a teenager was in the room, we wouldn't do many things that we do. Why? Because we're ashamed or we're not comfortable doing things that are inappropriate in front of somebody else. Yet God's presence that is here sometimes doesn't affect us. There's a very interesting story with the Chavetz Chaim, one of the great teachers that is very famous for the importance of speaking good and kind about other people. He's less famous for, but he's also well known for his instruction about making Mashiach a priority in our lives. A great holy man, the Chavetz Chaim. So in those days, of course, there are many interesting stories about him where he encountered people who didn't know who he was. Because in those days, he lived in the late 1800s. There wasn't so many cameras and pictures of people. So you could encounter somebody and not know he is the great Chavetz Chaim. So there was a wagon driver who was giving him a ride, and the wagon driver didn't know who he was, and he didn't announce who he was. And as he's going in the wagon driver says, I'm a little bit hungry. I'm going to stop over at the side of this guy's house. I'm going to grab a couple fruit off his tree. But do me a favor. Keep an eye out for the guy while I go climb the wall and pluck some fruit. Make sure nobody's watching. I don't want to get caught stealing from this tree. So the Chavetz Chaim says, sure. And as the guy's he finishes climbing the fence and he's about to pluck a fruit from the tree, and the Chavetz Chaim says, hey, he's watching. The guy jumps down, jumps into the wagon and speeds off. And he says, thank you so much. Thank you. He says, by the way, who was watching? Was it a guard? Was it the owner? He said, no, it was Hashem. So what does that mean? Didn't this guy know Hashem is watching? Sometimes we don't think about that. We're worried, is someone watching? Is someone see me? It's inappropriate what I'm doing, but is anybody watching me? Hashem is watching. So how do we get that feeling? And that's the question we're addressing here. It's great to tell us that we have within ourselves a soul and a fire and a fear of God and all these wonderful things. But how do we connect to it? We can't see God. God, you're invisible. I can't see you. How do we connect? So that's where we're starting from today. We're on page Samach, which would be equivalent of 119, where the word in the beginning of that line, about 2/3 down, is Royeh, but halfway down we have the following word, V'gam. So we're on page Samach, on the bottom, towards the bottom of the page, V'gam. V'gam ki ein lo demus haguf. You might say to yourself, how can I relate to God? He has no body. God is bodiless. He is invisible. He's not seen. I relate to him. I don't see two eyes watching me. A lot of times you go into a building, you go to someone's house today, or you go anywhere, there's a video camera. And immediately you realize someone's watching. What's if you can't see the video camera? You feel no one's watching. So how do I relate to God? The Alter Rebbe's answer is so beautiful. It's really wonderful. He says, on the contrary, because he has no eyes, because he doesn't have to have a body and a place that he has to be, his watching you is much, much more complete. What does that mean? Let's take for in a second the human being. We have two systems of awareness. One is how we communicate that which is outside of ourselves, and one is that how we communicate with things that are inside of ourselves. Things that are outside of ourselves require what's called our outside interface, called the five senses. In order to see someone else, I need to have eyes. In order to hear someone else, I need ears. In order to smell something else, I need a smell. In order to everything you have, which is not part of yourself, requires a special device to interface and a tool, almost like a reporting device. Someone give me a message, send me a text. What does that look like? What does that smell like? What does that taste like? How does that feel? It's all messages coming from outside, and a reporter is sending you a headline, a text message, an update to you. Who are you? You are your brain. When something goes inside of you, you don't need an outside reporter to tell you. So for an example, even if you are blindfolded and you're wearing headphones that cancel any noise, and someone goes and flicks your ear, or God forbid hits you, you don't have to say, hey, nothing happened, I didn't see it. Because it happened to you, you don't have to see it, you don't have to hear it, it's inside of you. If you burn your toe, God forbid, or if you're cold, or if you're hot, or if you're ashamed, any feeling you have, that's what's inside of you, doesn't require the five senses, because the five senses are only required when something happens outside of you. In other words, only something which is disconnected from you requires the five senses, requires eyes. But something which is inside of you doesn't require it. Hashem's presence in this world is not outside of the world. Hashem's presence in the world is the world. The world is godliness. Not, God forbid, that the world is a God. But everything you see is an expression. Going back to the famous metaphor we used a long time ago about these two children inside your mother's womb. And one says to the other twin, these two children inside the womb, and one says to the other, do you believe in mom? And he says, of course I don't believe in mom. I've never seen mom. And they have this discussion if mom exists or not. I've never seen mom. They say, where do you think everything comes from? I don't know, but it's not mom. I've never seen her. In other words, sometimes you can't see mom because that's all that's around you. God is everything. As we'll see at the end of this page, he is the source of all. He is everything. It's like a fish in the water may not see the water because he's entirely surrounded by water. In other words, God does not need eyes to see you and to feel you and to hear you and to watch you, because you're a part of him. No more than you need eyes to see if something is on your lap or something is touching your toe. You don't have to see it. It's a sense you have because there's two ways you interact. One is your brain. Your brain feels and knows every part of your body, if you're healthy, of course, God willing. If a person is healthy and functioning properly, the brain senses every inner pain, every outer pain, every sensation, every change in temperature, every feeling, every emotion, every desire, every want. Why? Because the brain is you. You are that thinking brain where your soul, where your essence resides. And therefore, you don't need senses to tell you what's going on. So if we think that we're outside of God and we're disconnected from God, then we say, hey, I can't see God's eyes. I can't see. But if you know you're part of God, you're a child in his womb, so to speak. You're completely a part of him. You should know at that point that God doesn't need eyes to see you. It's not like he could, how can he keep track of everything at once? How could my brain keep track of digesting my food, walking, chewing gum, looking around, listening to music, walking, feeling the pain on my back from yesterday's schlepping in the garden? You could feel all that because for you, your brain is all part of you. It's not waiting for reports that are coming in from outside, from the eyes, from the nose, from the ears, from the mouth, from your sensation of touch. It's all part of you that you feel and sense. That is how God senses us. So in other words, the fact that God doesn't have eyes doesn't make him less present, it makes him more present. He doesn't need eyes to see you. You don't have to have a feeling for someone to tell you that something hurts you or got cold in the room. You feel it and you know it immediately. As a matter of fact, you can see if your feet are cold, if your hands are cold, if your nose is cold, if your ears are cold. all that you know without any thinking, because you don't need to be told it, it's part of you. Let's see this inside. The gam ki ein loy demus haguf, even though God doesn't have a bodily form, so how can I be in tune to say God is watching? Says the Alter Rebbe, Hare Adrab, on the contrary, Hakol Goli v'yodua lefanov. Everything is known and revealed to him, b'yeser se'es, much more quantitatively and qualitatively, much more le'ein ketz, in an endless measure, meaning it is much, much more in God's awareness, more than your ears can tell you, and your eyes can tell you, your brain tells you. Because your eyes and ears are only tools, vessels, to communicate information from outside to within. Let you know there's someone else in the room, there's a bad smell, there's a good smell, there's nice music. All those things are outside of yourself. Rak al derech mashal, raku al derech mashal k'mei adam hayedeyo margish ba'atzmai. It's like a person who knows and feels kol mashanasev and nifel ve'echad b'kol ramachevarav. Like a person who senses and feels everything that happens to his 248 limbs. No one has to tell you that someone just stepped on your toe. No one has to tell you that suddenly it got cold in the room. Why? Because it's you. You sense self, every part of self completely. A good example would be a doctor. A doctor, sometimes you go to the doctor, you say, my back hurts you. So you don't have to be convinced and then told your back hurts you, you know that. The doctor says, what do you mean? I don't see it, I don't sense it, let me check. And he might do different tests and he doesn't see it. The fact that he doesn't see it means he doesn't see it because it's something disconnected from him. But you, who it's your back or your eye, you feel it and know it, even though you can't measure it and describe it maybe fully. You don't have to be able to see it or to hear it. It is a part of you that hurts. It could be an eye, it could be a leg, it could be an intestines. And this is the difference between something that comes from without or within. And the doctor can be much smarter than you, and much more knowledgeable of your body, and much more aware of all different medical conditions. But he is limited to his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth, and sense of touch. And therefore, only what his five senses can contact with could he see. But he can't feel what you feel. With all the experience he has, doesn't help him. But if it's you, you don't have to have the knowledge and experience. It's there. I don't have to have eyes on it. I feel it. Whether you're feeling cold, or you're feeling hot, even if it's the heat, someone put a heat element on your toe. You might say it's so disconnected from me. It's a part of the world that God doesn't spend much time in. You know, we're talking about Singapore, a small little house in Singapore. God knows what's going on there too. Just like you feel your toes 100%. You can't say, oh, it was my toes, and someone stuck a pin into it, I didn't feel it. It's the same sensation because it's you and you sense it no matter how seemingly remote it is from your brain. Al derech hamashal. For example, God forbid you were burned with fire, you would feel it fully without having to have any sort of educated insight into this. And same thing with every sensation, every feeling, and every emotion, you have it. So everything you're experiencing, and not just what you're experiencing, the sense of self, the awareness of self. You don't have to look in the mirror to say, hey, I am here. I forgot all about it. I was here the whole time. You don't need any proof or outside information. As a matter of fact, your true identity is your brain, is yourself, is your soul. And it's so integrated with your body in a phenomenal sense. We find a very interesting thing about people today in our generation. It's always been like this in different ways, but in our generation, we find something phenomenal. That your true self could come out and feel and experience something which you didn't even know was there, without any outside information. What does that mean? You have today tens and thousands of people rediscovering their Jewish roots. It could be their parents, or their grandparents, or their great-grandparents, or it could be they didn't even know they were Jewish, or they converted. But they had inside of themselves a Jewishness that was their identity, and they don't even know, like an outside analysis sort of way, why they're searching. But this is yourself. Your brain needs to be nourished, as we'll see a little further in this chapter. In other words, we find today one of the phenomenal things are that Jewish people are one of the highest percentages, even though we're the lowest number of in statistics. We are half of 1% or less than half 1% of the Jewish people, of the human people. Nevertheless, we're the highest numbers in all sorts of causes. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, we're very big into the cults. Now very big into all isms, whether it's for the benefit of this group or that group. We're fighting for something because we have a yearning inside of us that searches for meaning. It searches for expression. It's our true self that wants to come out. And sometimes it comes out and finds godliness and Judaism, and sometimes it finds saving whales or saving trees or saving, some cause. But there's a part of us, our true self. That true self is what we're talking about here. It's your identity. It's your brain. As we'll see in a minute, we're going to describe exactly what that is. And al-derech, this is what he says, is the true identity of God. God in this world senses and feels everything and knows it, not because he has eyes on the ball, not because he's watching with eyes and with a body. It's because he feels and senses every experience, which means something powerful. When you do something good, it's a part. If we're all a part of God, and that's why he feels us, that means every good deed that we're doing is a positive energy within godliness that's being strengthened or made or caused, as we'll see in a minute. And God forbid, every sin, every inappropriate behavior, any non-kosher food that we eat is affecting, I should say, a part of God in a real way, because there is no disconnect. There's no separation between world and God. God and the world is one. Not like Spinoza that said that the world is a godly power, but like Hasidic teaching that tells us that the godly power is expressed as world. There is no identity of world outside of godliness. That's what it means. God creates all. The and just like a person feels and senses and knows all that goes on within his body, emotionally, psychologically, physically, biologically, all the feelings we have, same thing Hashem senses and knows and is aware with 100% awareness of every single event that goes on in the world. And therefore, even if we don't see a video camera on top of us, or we don't see the guard watching, Hashem is not just watching, he's sensing and he's feeling and he's knowing all of our behavior. And why is that? Because we all come from God. There's no disconnect. Just like the light of a projector doesn't have identity for itself. If you would turn off the light of the projector, the light is gone. The existence of all of the worlds is a constant creation that comes from God. It's not a hologram because we actually exist. But the metaphor is only in the sense that there's no disconnect or there's no existence of the light outside of the projector. As long as the projector is projecting light, as long as God's projecting creation, he's not called the creator past tense, he's called the creator present tense. God is constantly creating the world. And that means he's constantly engaging the world. As we'll see when we get, God willing, to the section of describing God himself in the next section of Tanya, called Shar Yichud Ve'emunah, we'll see that God did not create the world like a man creates a piano or a person creates a computer, that after he's done, he could leave it. He creates the world like someone who's pushing against force, something upwards. If you would push, for an example, if you have a blower blowing a balloon up in the air, pushing something upwards, rolling something uphill, it only goes against nature as long as you're applying pressure. The second you stop, it returns. That means the existence of the world is unnatural in the world of God. And therefore, what makes us exist is the constant creation force by God to keep us going, keep us creating. That means God's constantly engaged. That means he is constantly aware, watching, feeling, sensing, and experiencing everything we're doing. Like King David said in his final farewell speech to the Jewish people, when they were gathering money to help support the future construction of the Beis HaMikdash that would be built by his son, Shlomo, King Solomon, he says, he says, God, everything he turns to God while the Jewish people were coming and he's saying farewell. He says, God, everything comes from you. We have our flesh and our blood and our money and our health. It all comes from you. So the recognition that everything comes from God, in other words, we're like those little infants or pre-born infants inside the mother's womb, that everything we have, it's not just that we get food from God. Our existence, our identity, our nature, it's all our nurture, everything is from the mother. And this is what we say when davening coming up soon. Someone mentioned before, the high holidays coming up soon is, we're going to say in davening Rosh Hashanah, V'gamli kol hayitzuru nichad mimeka. No creative being could hide from God. You can't hide from Hashem, because Hashem is all present and all knowing and all aware, just like your foot can't hide from your brain. You can't say, you know what, my foot's going incognito, The brain will not be aware of the foot for the next couple hours. You can't do that. You could say incognito when you're a person that's being watched by your eyes and you get blindfolded, or the lights go off and you can't see, or because the person's too far away. But that's only true when something is outside of yourself. But when it's of yourself and it's not the five senses communicating to you, it's a direct interaction with the brain, then it's automatically known. As a side note, we can now appreciate what we said earlier in this chapter, the idea that a Rebbe, that a tzaddik, has that concept too of being the brain of the Jewish people. Just like we have a brain within our body that has to remain in communication and is fully aware of everything that goes on inside the body, the same way we say a tzaddik, a true tzaddik of a generation, like the Alter Rebbe said in chapter 2, and he said again in this chapter, is like the brain of a Jewish people. What does that mean? When the Rebbe became Rebbe, the Rebbe's mimer that he said to officially accept his leadership as Rebbe was a fascinating mimer about the role of our generation, about our role is to inspire and transform the world, not just to be good, but to inspire others to be good, etc. But he said the primary behavior that the Jew requires is love of a fellow Jew. And he went and he shared a story from each of the Rebbes. He shared a story of the Alter Rebbe and the Middle Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek. He shared a story from each of the Rebbes about how you see their tremendous love for a fellow Jew. One of the stories he shared is the story of the Rebbe Maharash, the fourth Rebbe. That one time, he in general was a very, very, all the Rebbes were very busy, but he would work with tremendous amount of capacity each day. He would pack in tremendous amount, and while the Rebbes would like to daven at length, he was done davening very early in the morning because he would start learning and teaching, and he was very busy. One day he tells his son, we're going on a trip to Paris. He goes to Paris. They were at that time living in a city called Karahat. They went to Paris. And in Paris, he goes to one of the hotels, one of the fancy hotels there. And as they check in, he asks the guy, on which floor is the casino? So they tell him, he said, I'd like a room on that floor. They go into that floor, they check into the room, and then he comes out, he says, so where can I find the casino? And he starts walking to the casino, and he walks in, and he sees there a gentleman, happened to be a Jewish guy, not religious at all, and he was sipping wine. Of course, the wine wasn't technically a kosher wine, because to be kosher wine, it has to be with a certain seal, etc. And the Rebbe Maharash goes over to him and he says, younger man, young fellow, you know that when you drink wine that's not kosher, it affects your mind and it doesn't allow you to function as a Jew properly. It's time to do tshuva. He walks back to his room and he says to his son, okay, we can check out, we can leave now. That's the story. And the Rebbe points out that young man, after that encounter, came back to Lubavitch and he became observant and he raised children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that were all in the way of Torah and mitzvahs. That's the story the Rebbe says when he became Rebbe. He said 6 or 7 such stories, one about each Rebbe. The question is, how did the Rebbe know that this person was in that particular casino at that time? So if we understand that a Rebbe is like a brain of a people, he senses and feels all of our pains, all of our suffering, all of our challenges, the same way you feel within your body. As you know, there's a beautiful story from Shmuel Kaplan about this woman who writes to the Rebbe. She's like a 22-year-old woman, writes to the Rebbe about a tremendous emotional and challenging life she's having, a lot of challenges in life. She wrote 2, 3, 4 pages to the Rebbe. The Rebbe responded to her and started off, I feel your pain. And she was very offended. She wrote back to the Rebbe, what do you mean you feel my pain? You don't know me. You don't know my pain. What do you mean you feel my pain? The Rebbe wrote back to her the following, and it's beautiful. I've shared it before, but it's really telling. The Rebbe wrote back to her. He said, God willing, you'll be blessed soon to find your mate and you'll get married. And you're going to have a child. And you will see in the first year of the child's life, the child begins teething, and it's a very, very painful process for the child, the teething process. What you should know, as much as it hurts the child, it hurts the mother even more to watch the child teething. And the Rebbe said, that's how I feel your pain. In other words, the Rebbe was telling her something. We're not disconnected. I'm not just another Jew who out there has some sort of empathy to you. The brain is the one that senses the pain sometimes more than the limb. We know, unfortunately, if God forbid a limb is disconnected from the body. I've heard stories with, unfortunately, some relatives that we had that had to have an amputation due to a disease. They have something called phantom itching. Phantom itching. That means even though your ankle is gone, you can still itch. The brain senses the itch, even though it's not there. In other words, sometimes the brain could really sense it more than the extension. So Hashem, now obviously the Rebbe is a created being, is a human being. Hashem is the creator. Imagine how much he senses your pain. Whether it's a physical pain that you're having a hard time in your marriage or your children or your health or anxiety or other issues, whether it's your spiritual pain. So he's telling us, think about this, that it's not some disconnected eye that sees and ear that hears. It's your brain, it's yourself, it's your essence that's affected. Let's go back on the top of this page. Sorry, last line of the previous page. As the Maimonides says, and the Alter Rebbe points out a very interesting thing here. He puts in parentheses, and parenthetically in brackets, he says, first, before the parentheses, he says, like the Rambam says himself, and he writes, and is agreed to by the authorities of Kabbalah, the wise men of Kabbalah, and he mentions in particular, the Ramak, Moshe Rapoport, we all know him as the one who put together the Friday night service. When we do services Friday night, who invented that concept? Why doesn't Ma'ariv start Friday night the same as every night from Shema? Because he added on this whole thing, L'chon Aranana and L'chadaydi. Some of the stuff was taken from Tillim, some was composed by other Kabbalists, some was composed by the Arizal, but they composed and put together, it was him and his brother-in-law, Rabbi Levi Alkabatz, who put together this beautiful Friday night prayer based on mysticism, etc. But the reason why the Alter Rebbe quotes him here, the Rebbe explains, is because the Alter Rebbe was a very big, not just believer, but encourager of not to have the mystical part of Judaism and the practical part of Judaism disconnected. You can't have tefillin without soul, or you can't have goodness without godliness, meaning merging it together. And therefore he mentions the Rambam, who was an authority on Jewish law, and he right away says, and that fits with the Ramak, Rabbi Moshe Rapoport, who was authority on mysticism, to tell you it's not one or the other. This is the holistic, to complete the perfect package. He said, what does he say? By God knowing himself, just like a man knows himself, and therefore he feels his limb, and he feels his ankle, and he feels his neck, and he feels the pain in the eye. It's amazing. You wake up in the morning and you have a headache. No one has to tell you, by the way, I'm getting the sensation that I might be having a headache. Let me check into it. You have it, you know it, you feel it, and you can't get past it. You can't even think clearly. Why? Because you sense completely every pain, even though your brain should be able to function without paying attention to the pain in your leg or the ache in your back. But you can't, because that is you. So Hashem, the same thing, cannot be separated from the experiences, the feelings, and the behavior of every single Jew. This is all coming, as we'll see, to tell us how we can all tap into the sphere of God, this awareness of God, if we think about this and meditate about this every day. And that's going to be what we say next Wednesday. But let's first finish this. By God being self-aware, he is aware of every single creation, creature, as distant as it may be. That means every little mouse, every blade of grass, every cricket, every human being, every child, every sheep, every cow, every existence. We are able to keep track of all 248 limbs. And God can keep track of the trillions and trillions and trillions of planets, stars, and all the existence the same way. He has a much, much more greater capacity, and he's aware of every single existence constantly in full awareness. But, and this is a very important but says the Alter Rebbe, don't make this following mistake. While it's true that this metaphor is a great metaphor, but it's only a great metaphor to get the message across to us, but it's not accurate. Why isn't it accurate? I'll tell it to you outside first, then we'll do it inside. And this is a very important concept in Chassidus. A body and a soul is not a one-way street, meaning it's not that you have a body, and the body needs the soul to have life and to have abilities and energy and light and warmth and spirituality, and the soul is just a giver. It's a two-way street. The soul is completely affected by the body. We have an expression that says, a small hole in the body is a huge hole in the soul. In other words, if you're not healthy, your soul isn't healthy. You can't say, well, I don't take care of my body because I'm so spiritual. That's not spiritual. That's abusive, not just to your body, it's abusive to your soul. Exercising, eating healthy, being stable emotionally and psychologically, and biologically fit is not just a good thing to do to take care of the body that you were entrusted to by God, that at birth he gave you this gift or this lease, called a body that you have to maintain and take care of. That's the only way to be a good, healthy maintainer of your soul. Your soul and body make a perfect merge, more than a marriage of a husband and wife. They become so one that you can't separate it. You can't separate. The person can't say, you know, I feel happy or sad or spiritual in my arms or my legs and my head. Your entire body and your entire soul become one. And every experience, just like when you eat food, it makes you healthy. You eat food could be hurting your body. If you eat, God forbid, shellfish or pork, if you're Jewish, if you're a Gentile, it's good for you, shellfish or pork. Just don't eat from a live animal. But if you're a Jew, all these things can hurt your body. Everything you say or do which is inappropriate can affect and damage and harm and abuse your soul. There are souls that are tortured, living a miserable life because they're living inside of bodies that are having miserable existences. And it's not just the body that suffers. And the same thing in the positive. Every single thing we do in a physical world has a huge impact. Everything we see, everything we read, everything we talk about has a huge impact on our soul. That's the journey of the soul. And soul is meant to go and try and transform the body and try and, it takes effort. And the body is meant to try and impact the soul positively. And that's what happens, whether you like it or not. That's what happens. So in the body, the impact of the soul on the body and the body on the soul is a two-way street. But with God and the people, while what happens right now, we're going to mention a contradiction in statement. While on one hand, God is 1,000% engaged with the world, feels and senses and knows, etc., etc., he is in no way impacted, changed, or affected by the world. What does that mean? One of the things we're saying at davening is God is the same before creation and after creation. If we can affect God, then we're saying that God is not the same after creation. We made him better. We made him finer. We made him happier. So what we're saying is something which is impossible for the eyes, for the ears to hear and the mind to understand. That two opposites happen at the same time. While God is 1,000% engaged and one with the universe, he is completely transcended at the same exact time. I know it doesn't seem to make sense, and it's hard to understand that because it seems not to make, how could you have both? You can't have them engaged and disengaged at the same time. Yet, that's what God does. On one hand, he's completely engaged, and that's how we use the metaphor of the body and the soul, that the soul engages the body 1,000%. At the same time, God is 1,000% transcendent, and he is above the world, and as far as he's concerned, the world doesn't exist. So the way we explain it in Chassidus, so we could do this more as we go into the next section of Tanya in about 6 years, whenever we get there, we're going to talk and basically explain that God has different ways he engages with the world. No different with Einstein had, I shouldn't say no different, I would say in a way similar. If Einstein had a 2-year-old child that he was engaging, he can engage him as Einstein and fully share with him the brilliance, which wouldn't benefit the 2-year-old at all. He would have no idea what's going on. Or he could pretend to be a little goofy and crawl on his hands and feet with the child and make silly jokes, and then the child can relate to him. So which is the real Einstein? It depends. When he's engaging his son, he's really being a father. And when he's teaching a class, he's really being Einstein, the teacher. So there's different elements how he relates into and how the child perceives him. But truthfully speaking, him and his child have no connection intellectually. They have every relationship biologically, every relationship emotionally with love, but intellectually there's no connection with a 2-year-old. Zero. Not even a drop of relationship there. Nothing. So again, there's different ways to understand these concepts when we say God is 100% transcendent and 100% engaged at one. But as he's going to say himself in the next few lines, it's something our minds have trouble understanding because God in his essence is out of our area of understanding. But the key he wants to say is here that there are two primary differences from the metaphor of a body and a soul, or I should say the brain and the body, different than God and the world. One is that God remains transcendent, and the second one is that the world does not have a separate existence outside of godliness. What does that mean? A body and the soul, when God forbid life ends and the soul disengages from the body, the soul goes back to its source and doesn't die. You know, we say Jewish people don't believe in afterlife because the soul never dies, so it's not afterlife, it's life continues. So the soul continues to live, but the body lives separately. If the God would disengage from the world would cease to exist. So there's really two reasons why this metaphor is not the best metaphor. One is, says the Alter Rebbe, one is because God remains transcendent from the universe as much as he engages it, unlike the soul and the brain that engages and becomes one, is not transcendent from the body, and therefore is affected by it. The body can affect the soul. And the second thing is, could the body exist outside of the soul, outside of the brain? Yes, the body could exist. It may not function, it may, God forbid, be paralyzed or it won't move, but the body can exist, whereas the world cannot exist outside of God's engagement. If God would, God forbid, if God would, God forbid, disengage from the world would cease to exist 1,000%. Not like it would slowly crumble or lose power like an engine that runs out of gas. It would cease to exist because its entire existence is the godly life force pushing it, as we mentioned before, uphill, pushing it against the status quo that it should be, and makes it exist. So two reasons he says why this metaphor might be a little bit just to make a point and not to be an exact match. Just to finish off today's topic, today's things, I want to make it to the two dots here. He says something very amazing. No, he's going to, what I just said outside, he's going to say it inside out. The truth to be told, the metaphor of the parable really doesn't fully engage this topic or explain it properly. He nefesh ha'adam, because I want to remind what we mentioned very early in Tanya, that we really have three souls. To make ourselves more seemingly complicated, but really makes us much more, this makes sense. We have three souls. We have our godly soul, which is purely selfless, has no interest in self, only in purpose and mission. We have an animal soul that is divided into three responsibilities. It is the biological drive, meaning gives us our five senses. It's called the natural soul. It is our vital soul. It gives us life. That's how come we breathe. That's why our blood has a temperature and our heart beats. It's because we have life coming in, and it's our animal soul. So the animal soul itself has three names: the vital soul, the natural soul, and the animal soul. Vital means it gives us life. It gives us, that's why like I said, our heart beats. Our natural soul means that's why we have the natural ability for five senses to work, and the taking care of our physical sense, and the desire to want to be healthy, and not to, God forbid, burn ourselves. And the third aspect is the animal soul, which is a very selfish creature. It only wants to feel good, to have its back scratched, take care of itself. And the primary struggle in our life is the animal part of our animal soul. That's why we call it the animal soul primarily. And our godly soul, the struggle. Are we into selfish behavior or selfless behavior? Are we into the here and now or long term? What feels good or is important? What makes God happy or makes us happy? Are we God-centered or Moshe-centered? Who is the real us? And then there's the third part. So you have the godly soul, the animal soul, and the thinking soul. The thinking soul is only mentioned twice in Tanya. One's right here. He mentions it right here. The thinking soul is who is deciding if your godly soul is pushing you this way and your animal soul is pushing you that way. So who is the deciding soul? The answer is nefesh hasichlis, your intelligent self. You make a decision. Am I going to listen to my alarm clock and jump out of bed and run to shul, take care of my kids, run daven, do exercise, whatever I got to do? Or am I going to be in a moment of selfish behavior and stay in bed and not get out of bed? Who makes that decision? Your intellectual, your intelligent self. It's called nefesh hasichlis, my intelligent self. And really, you could say is you have the body, which is engaged with the animal soul, which is engaged with the thinking soul, which is engaged with the godly soul. So all three or all four components become like a Havdalah candle mixed into one, adapted to one holistic identity called you or me. That is our identity, a body with three parts of a soul, a godly, an animal, and thinking soul. So he says here, not just does our behavior affect the animal soul and our body, not just does it affect the thinking soul, but it also affects the godly soul. And that's what he said, unlike God, that he does not get affected by the human and the world experience. So inside he says like this, because the soul of man, afilu asichlis, even the intellectual soul, velikis on the godly soul, he is affected emotionally and practically by the events of the body and its pain, but but nefesh achiyonus, being completely engaged in the animal soul, meaning the experience of the godly soul and the intellectual soul, the intelligent soul, being engaged in the animal soul, which is engaged with the body. So it's almost like an adapter into an adapter into adapter. We're all coming to one package: body, animal soul, intellectual soul, godly soul, all into one thing. They're all affected by your experience. So if you're going to eat a healthy meal, whether it's physically healthy, whether it's spiritually healthy, it doesn't just affect the body and the animal soul, the thinking soul, your godly soul is affected too. But God, God's not affected by the world events, nor the world changes in the world. None of the events in the world affect God. I'm saying it quickly because I explained it already. None of the events in the world affect God himself, meaning affect a change in God, because God is unchangeable. Truth doesn't change. Essence doesn't change. It's God is how he was before and after. Nothing can affect and change the essence of God. And then he gives this disclaimer, so to speak, to understand this clear in our mind, how we can't affect God, and yet at the same time, God is fully engaged and one with the world. All these things were gone through at great length by the Kabbalists, but not all of us are wise enough or have the vessels capable enough to understand it. He says, and bottom line, he says, this is something which most of us will have a very hard time understanding. But he says, trust me, the Kabbalists went through this clearly in their writings that you can examine. And we could all say clearly with faith, as we say in davening every morning, God, you are the same essence, unchanged, before you created the world and after you created the world. So what we're saying here so far was we wanted to explain one primary point, and that is, how can we say we should be affected by God's watching, so to speak, and God's eyes on the field, and God's watching and listening, if we can't see him? And the answer is, if you can't see him, then it's even more present. If you could see him, you could, there's my father once had a joke about, they had a party, and they had a sign by these cupcakes, everyone take one only, God is watching. So somebody went to the chicken wings and wrote, take as many as you want, God's watching the cupcakes. In other words, if you think that God is watching with his eyes, so if he's busy over there, he's not looking there. But if you know what doesn't do with his eyes, then he can't just be distracted. So we're saying here that why we should feel, this is a thing that, by the way, mentioned 2 weeks ago, requires a meditation day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, to affect us. Because we live in a world where we can't see God. So we have to constantly think about this, and the more we think about it, the more we integrate this into our minds, the more it affects us. Next week, we're going to go to, we're about at 2 dots now on 20. We're going to go back to the very beginning of this chapter. In the very beginning, we started saying that Moshe Rabbeinu says, yeah, fear of God is easy. Why? Because you have within you some Moses. Then we're going to go back now and now articulate this in the coming week. I'll stop here. It's a good time for questions. This was a big idea we shared today. I like it's a juicy idea. It's very enjoyable to learn this, but it's also something, a bit of a leap in our thinking. And therefore, if anyone has a question or some other point, feel free to share.